So what if I was to tell you that it was possible to drive for thousands and thousands of miles in the Western US, sleep in a tent every night, and not pay a single cent for camping? In this video, I'm going to tell you how to do exactly that. I've spent the last several years roaming across the Western US, both in my capacity as a wildlife biologist, as well as a filmmaker and travel vlogger who tries to capture the beauty and wonder of various parts of the natural world and the human history that's occupied this landscape in all these amazing places across the Western US. And in this capacity of traveling around everywhere, through the use of something called dispersed camping, I've never paid a single cent for campgrounds. And after having discovered dispersed camping, probably never will. So what exactly is dispersed camping? What is this kind of magical process that will allow you to camp for free out in these publicly owned lands? And the best way to think about this is that in standard campgrounds, what most people experience when they go out camping, there are certain facilities for your camping. There are places that have a set of toilets, of public restrooms, that have garbage cans for your garbage, that have pre-cleared out sites and flattened ground so you can set your tent or your RV or whatever it is that you're camping with onto this spot. It is very much built around your presence and your convenience. And dispersed camping is basically camping in public lands literally anywhere else. So places that are not explicitly designed for camping, but still can be camped on because these are publicly owned properties. So before I get too much further into this, I should really say that by public lands, I'm really actually referring to a subset of the public lands that exist. National parks in particular have very specific regulations about where you're allowed to camp and where you aren't, and that will often be the case for state parks as well. And so when I typically talk about dispersed camping, I'm talking about camping in things like lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, lands managed by the National Forest Service, and lands managed by individual state forest agencies. Okay, so one question you might ask is, what can I expect from dispersed camping, and how does it differ from the more classical camping experience that most people think of? And one of the first things you really need to ask yourself is, how badly do you need the amenities? Oh my gosh, the services that are found in most campgrounds, right? How badly do you want things like public toilets or running water or things like that? Definitely dispersed camping is something for people who are a little more self-sufficient in what they're able to bring with them and how they're able to interact with the landscape. You'll often have to bring your own water to places, bring a shovel, bring toilet paper, and bury your waste whenever possible. And you'll have to kind of have an eye for where's a good place to set a tent, where isn't. But if you're willing to deal with those kinds of relative inconveniences when compared to a site that's fully serviced, then you can have an amazing experience. A lot of campgrounds are often really crowded. There are lots of people. There might be some, group of partying college students on one side and some screaming children on the other. And it's hardly a blissful experience. There's often lots going on, sun speaking out. Whereas with dispersed camping, you are very much in charge of the operation. Very, very seldomly do you have people around you. So you can camp by yourself or with a small group of people out in the middle of the woods and really experience the kind of more wild side of nature a lot more than you would if you were in a campground where everything has been kind of preset for people. So far we've established that dispersed camping is camping in areas and public lands that are not in designated campsites, but are much more free-flowing and wild and in places that you kind of find on your own, places that are convenient for you to set up your tent, etc. So what are the rules and regulations here? Is it a complete Wild West free-for-all, or is it very, very limited and very, very heavily restricted? And the answer to that is yes, and everywhere in between. But, to be just a little more helpful, it really will vary by the state that you're in. The BLM tends to be, in my experience, less restrictive than things like the Forest Service or the state forest agencies. But it's really going to vary from state to state and from location to location. But the one thing you can definitely say, and this is a hard and fast rule everywhere, is keep your eyes open for signs that restrict where you're allowed to camp. Because as a general rule, if there aren't signs that explicitly say that you can't camp in an area, usually you can camp there. and you're not going to run into too much trouble. It's always best to be more out of the way if possible. You don't want to park your car in a place where people who are turning onto a road are going to have to dodge around you all the time. But, just kind of use your common sense rationality, and more often than not, nobody's going to bother you if you're camped in a certain location. Here's something really important that I want to talk about that I think is really, really integral to this idea of dispersed camping and being able to sustainably engage in this kind of behavior for days or weeks on end as you're traveling throughout the Western US. And it's more of a philosophy than an actual law or rule, but this is the idea of leave no trace camping. And it's this idea that if you find a site, if you find a dispersed camping location, the most ideal thing to do and the best way to behave is to make it so that once you leave, nobody would be able to know that you specifically were in that location. So you really want to go out of your way to avoid doing things like leaving around garbage, or especially leaving around toilet paper. Not something you want to do, but unfortunately in places, it's something that you see all the time where people get lazy about how they deal with toilet paper. And so some of the worst offenders, you'll go into a site and you'll just see toilet paper just lying around everywhere. Not a good look, not great, not something you want to do. So instead, you really want to just make sure that you leave as little impact on the area as possible. Throw down your tent, put it down, make sure that you clean up all your stuff, keep your garbage away, and try to do as little damage to the surrounding area as possible. Clear out as little vegetation, just act in a way that your own individual impact is going to be lessened. And as a consequence, the collective impact of all sorts of people are also lessened. And I'm going to film some of the stuff you see in the spot here. Right now, I'm at this tiny little square of BLM land surrounded by private lands outside of Bandon, Oregon. And this is some of the kind of stuff that you'll see that you really don't want to do, right? We have this amazing resource, and you really want to treat that resource respectfully instead of just kind of trashing it. And I'm afraid there are some unfortunate examples of that in this area. And I'm just going to quickly film a sequence here, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so back to the talking head. There's one thing I really want to point out about that sequence, and I really don't want the take-home message to be that everywhere in nature you're just going to see landscapes and landscapes of trash and garbage all over the place. But I really just want it to be an example of the kind of thing that can happen and the kind of thing that you can see, and just something to strive to be better than, right? There are people that genuinely treat our public lands like they're their own personal dumping grounds, just place to put human waste and ruin this thing that we all collectively own. And if you're going to go out and engage in dispersed camping because you watched this video and were inspired to experience nature in this way, just engage in the leave no trace philosophy. Think about the impacts that you're having in the landscape and just try to minimize them. Leave it clean and make it so that somebody else can experience the site without having to have that experience ruined by all the trash and garbage that some people leave around. Okay, so how do I find these places? If I want to go out to some part of the West and I'm looking for a place to camp, how do I actually locate some BLM land that may not be immediately apparent if you're using something like Google Maps or something along those lines, right? How do I find these public lands to camp in and locate a site and set things up and find yourself a nice isolated place well out of the way of everybody to set up your camp and enjoy a night of sleeping in the woods? And so to do that, I'm going to run you through this process. I'm going to kind of show you from the very start what I end up doing and how I locate these things. So step one, obviously you need to find out where the public lands in the area that you are actually located. And there's not always a guarantee that there will be public lands there, but there is so much public land in the West that depending on the state you're in, almost certainly there's going to be something within decent driving distance of where you want to go. Some states have more public lands than others. The reality is that a huge amount of the West is covered in these public spaces. To actually locate where the public lands by you are, you'll want maps. The modern era of digital technology is so unbelievably useful for this. It's just so astonishing how helpful certain apps on your phone can be. And there are a number of apps that will show you certain land boundaries and stuff like that. And I can't necessarily give a list of all of them just because there are so many, but I can tell you what I personally use. And that's an app called The Dirt. And that's Dirt with a Y, D-Y-R-T. And particularly with a paid for or pro version, it'll give you a set of layers that you can add to the map that will show you the delineation of land boundaries of like the BLM and National Forest Service in particular. And that app really is my go-to. This is the one that I've used in many, many thousands of miles of wandering around the West. And it has just been such a benefit because you can't always necessarily see that an area is in fact public land based on signs. There are often little patches, like little squares that might just have a random fence that wraps around it. It may not have any signs at all that it's actually public land, but once you look at these apps, you can see that from the land boundaries that you are actually standing on an area that you can potentially camp in, right? And I found that just so useful because there are so many kind of out of the way locations and going into some side highway and going onto an off road that turns into another road that turns into another road that finally takes me to where I want to go that you can find by using this particular app. Okay, so if I want to go out and I want to find some public land to do some dispersed camping in, I'm going to kind of walk you through the process and show you what I do if I want to go locate some place to throw down my tent for the night. For this example, I found some public land by Brookings, Oregon. So while I was in the city, I pulled up my phone, looked at the maps on the app, and it suggested a certain road to turn on that if you followed it would turn onto another road, and that in turn would eventually move through a section of BLM land. And if you actually looked at the app, you can zoom in, and where you zoom in, you'll find that in fact there's a separate road that's an actual BLM road that's owned, operated, and managed by the BLM. And these are the kinds of roads that are especially useful because you know that these are the things that are going to move through the public lands and they're the kind of places that you're going to search for to actually find these campsites. So once you find the area that has the public land that you're looking for, once you actually get close to that site, I'll actually swap out of an app like Google Maps, something that will give me the approximate area that doesn't necessarily show where the land boundaries are for the BLM in this case. So instead, I'll open up the Dirt app and put it on my phone holder on the dashboard, which will allow me to see where that little blue circle is that shows my location relative to the public lands. And once I start getting close, and enter the public land boundary, then I can know to start searching for some of these side roads that you find on the app. So I'll often stop my car and zoom in and take a look at what's going on, where the land boundaries are, where the roads are, and I'll find one of the roads and I'll pull onto it and I'll start driving. And once you're at that point, you know that probably somewhere along the length of this road, you'll find a spot that can really, really work for a dispersed campsite. Okay, so what do I look for when I'm actually trying to find a campsite to stay in? And there are really a few things that you really want to keep in mind. One of them is what exactly are you bringing with you and how much space do you actually need? When I'm on these solo journeys that I take often, I have like a one-person tent that doesn't take up too much room. So really what I'm looking for is a spot where I can park my Jeep and a relatively flat open location where I can put my tent down. If you're taking a larger tent, or if you have more people that want to share a tent, if you have larger vehicles, or if you have something like RVs, what you look for is going to vary a little bit from what I look for in terms of how much space you actually need. With the setup that I have, I can definitely camp in locations that may be more difficult if you have a larger rig and stuff like that with you. So one of the nice things about dispersed camping is that it really is a very kind of minimalist activity. you aren't necessarily swimming in comforts, but that very lack of requiring specific comforts is a big part of the enjoyment of the process, where you don't need to find places that have a public restroom and a certain distance to certain services. You're just out in nature and letting the way you interact with nature dictate all of your activities, right? It's really, really, really enjoyable, as long as you're okay with not necessarily having those elements of civilization with you. So if I'm looking for a campsite, I'm really only looking for two things. One, can I pull off of the road? So a lot of these back roads that you'll find, it's really helpful to have something like a four-wheel drive vehicle with some clearance, because the range of options that you can take if you're going out dispersed camping is gonna be a lot greater if you have a vehicle that will allow you to access some of these backcountry roads. You know, as you can see from the time-lapse footage here, the BLM road that I followed had these just gigantic, huge pits in the ground where some of the stuff had worn away. And if you have like a standard car without any kind of like clearance or four-wheel drive for things, you're gonna have fewer options. You can still definitely do it. You know, when I was doing my big 6,000 miles in a month journey out west last November, I was driving a very, very not four-wheel drive white car, right? It was definitely not what I would call a field vehicle, but I was still able to make it work, right? I just wasn't able to go into some locations I otherwise may have. But don't let that discourage you from actually going through this, because even with a simple car, there are many, many places where you can still access. Just drive carefully, don't do anything too crazy, avoid gigantic, indents and stuff that can damage your car. But don't think that because you don't have a four-wheel drive vehicle, you're not going to be able to access these sites. So yeah, those are the two things I look for. Can I park my vehicle, and can I park my vehicle in a way that's off the road? So you don't want to park in the middle of one of these roads and have somebody unable to move without running into you or running into your tent or something like that. So you want to be completely off the road as much as possible, or at least have it so that there's plenty of wiggle room for people to move around you. And you also want some kind of flat space for your tent if that's what you're bringing. If you're sleeping in an RV, or if you're sleeping in a van or something like that, then that's a different story. You only need to be able to fit the vehicle. For me though, I will sleep in a little one-person tent. And so look for like an open clearing, exactly like this, right? So this whole area is the kind of thing that I'll often look for. Nice and flat, off the road, and this is basically somewhere where we'll then set up the tent and be able to camp for the night, and then wake up in the morning and go through some new journeys the following day and just explore the amazing things that this world has to offer. Okay, so I guess one last thing before I end this video, and being a beneficiary of the public lands in the West and the vast area that we are given the ability to roam in and wander in through the Western US, I really thought it would be important to at least recognize that the fact that I am able to wander these landscapes is the result of pretty monumental historical injustices. I can roam these public lands in the West because the indigenous peoples who lived here were forcibly removed from these landscapes through broken treaties and false promises, active removal, and war. And because of that, the way I think about the West is often just a little bit bittersweet. I think it's really important that we have this gratitude for these public spaces that we have, because much of the world doesn't really have what we do. And being able to roam these places allows me to live this kind of more wild existence that's closer to nature that really drives me as a person. But there also really needs to be colored with an awareness within this appreciation that what I have is because of what another group of people were very forcibly removed from, and their loss has been my gain historically. Anyway, I don't want to make the video too much about that fact, but I just felt like it really just wouldn't feel right to not at least recognize a lot of the troubling history of why I'm able to roam these lands. And so while I have immense gratitude for it, it also is shaped by a understanding of what it took. So with that little monologue done, that's gonna be the end of this video. I really hope that this is useful for you, that you're able to see new opportunities to go and roam around in nature that otherwise you may not have. You can literally wander the Western US and travel for thousands and thousands of miles. It's possible to spend absolutely nothing on campsites ever again. I am probably never going to purchase a campsite ever again because I don't mind the lack of amenities and I enjoy this more rustic existence. And overall, it just enriches my life so much. It gives me this sense of just awe that I'm able to interact with these wild landscapes and live in these wild places as a consequence of these public lands. And you know, one of my favorite things in the world is going into some piece of public land like some Forest Service or BLM land that I've never been to before, in the middle of the night, looking at these maps, showing up at these sites, putting down my tent and sleeping, and then wake up in the morning and everything you see around you is brand new to you. You've never seen these places before. You don't know what it is you're actually driving into. And I've seen some spectacular vistas and just amazing mountains all around me. And I'm able to have these experiences because of this privilege and right that we're given to engage in dispersed camping on public lands. And I hope that you too are able to have these experiences. And if you haven't followed my channel, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. I spend a lot of time wandering around the landscapes of the Western US and bringing this kind of cinematic eye, this eye for wonder and awe and beauty for the world around me, and try to bring it to you on your screens and help you experience these landscapes and experience these places and their histories that you may not have seen before. And I'm just so grateful to have this opportunity, and I hope that this brings you into a place that you also can undergo some of these experiences. And with that, I'm gonna call that the end of this video, and until next time everyone, wander in wonder.